Experts are increasingly talking about a banking crisis coming, not just in the United States, but in other Western countries. Delinquent commercial real estate loans at U.S. banks have hit their highest level in a decade, as higher interest rates and an uncertain economy and the rise of remote working pile pressure on building owners. That's what the Financial Times said, and there are stacks of other headlines about how Western banks could be facing some serious problems. You may not think that JP Morgan or Bank of America or wherever the big bank where you are is going to have a problem, but small and mid-sized banks could substantially have a problem. And look at what that did in 2023 to other bank stocks in the US. Look at the panic that caused. Look at how that reshaped the banking landscape. And so there is growing concern that the next economic shock in the US will be caused by the growing level of vacancy in commercial real estate. None of these are my words. This is all what publications we've been reading around the world are saying. This is not just happening in the United States, though. Germany's commercial real estate plunge could be a threat for banks. That's according to Euro News, who says that Europe's rapidly deteriorating commercial real estate crisis could potentially impact its banks as well. And so now in Germany, you have more developers facing bankruptcies. Several commercial and residential projects have been abandoned or postponed. Even in typically resilient Ireland, the analysts have now said there's no likelihood of a knock-on effect, but there have been price drops. This is the kind of thing we share insights on at Nomad Capitalist Live. It's our 4-day annual event. Danielle DiMartino Booth is speaking this year. She's a former Federal Reserve insider who knows what to make of this kind of thing. How should you adjust your investments? Go to nomadcapitalist.com/live and you can learn about joining us at that annual event. But I'm going to tell you what I think you should do, and that is what I always tell you to do, is diversify. The Western banking systems are run somewhat differently than banking systems around the world. Let's just talk about the offshore effect. There are offshore banks, often in tax havens or on small islands, where they're just going to store your money for you. They're not going to go out and loan your money out to commercial developers. And even the ones that do, generally speaking, they're not running up 300% ratios. They might go out and do properties at low LTVs, but there are literally offshore banks. They don't make loans. They are full reserve. They keep all your money there. And if that's something that you're looking for, there are offshore banks from the Caribbean to the Cook Islands that offer those kinds of services. And so what those banks do is they have relationships with larger banks around the world. Your money's not just sitting under a mattress somewhere in the Cook Islands. They move your money around, but it is not being loaned out. That's one benefit of offshore banking. But besides that, you look at banks in any number of countries, they are more stable, better, capital ratios, just better run than some of these Western banks, where I think the culture comes into play here. If you think that your economy is so secure and your country's always going to be on top, you're probably going to take more risks. And we're seeing that Western economies aren't always going to be on top. People are realizing the charade is over. Western economies, they're starting to see the cracks. People are realizing it's not all it's cracked up to be, but somehow the banks are still being more aggressive. You go to some of the Asian countries, and they are much more conservative in how they lend money out. That's partially why it's harder to get accounts at some of those banks, because they don't need more money. They have enough money. They can't figure out what to do with the money they have. And so Hong Kong, Singapore, I'll put my money in those banks over Western economies every single day. And I'll take the advantage if I'm an American, that I can actually hold different currencies overseas, because I might want to diversify my currency exposure. But the bottom line is you want to be diversified, and you want to do that from a perspective of understanding what's different between your country and the rest. I think there's more risk in a number of these Western economies where they just assumed the party would never end. That is something that does not culturally exist in many countries around the world. I think in Asia, for example, they're more methodical. Probably in some of the countries in the Gulf, more methodical. What I would suggest is either look at some of the banks where they don't lend your money out. That could be part of your banking portfolio. Also look at banks in a place like Singapore, where non-residents can get accounts for mid-six-figure sums. Can I diversify some of my money there? You don't have to move your money offshore. Now, there may be forms you have to file in any of these countries, and I suggest that you do file the forms and make sure that the government and the tax man knows where your money is, if that's a legal requirement. That's some of the tax professionals that we work with in our network do help our clients do, because we believe in legal tax reduction, legal diversification. So let's say I'm an American and I live in the United States. You don't have to leave the United States to move your money. You can go either through power of attorney, either through remote account opening in some jurisdictions, or maybe in the case of Singapore, you have to go there, for example. Make a little trip, open a bank account, move some money. You had money in one account, now you have money in another account. In addition to the ability to diversify into different currencies, in addition to some form of light asset protection, you now have a bank that is stronger. And all you've got to do is look at the list of the world's 50 strongest banks. There's maybe one that's in the United States. All three of the big banks in Singapore are on there. And by the way, so are the banks in Canada. You may not like those for different reasons, the more of the social reasons. But banks in Singapore, some of the most neutral-minded, some of the most objective, and some of the strongest banks that you'll find in the world. So money in a U.S. bank or an Australian bank or a British bank, it's the same money in the Singaporean bank, but with, in my opinion, less funny business going on, more stability. You can have that diversification. What I think you want to do is, if you have cash, as well potentially if you have stocks, look at bank and brokerage accounts. If you have precious metals while you're thinking about it, maybe those can be moved overseas in some capacity as well. And there may be forms to fill out depending on where you live that report to the government where you've moved your money offshore. We suggest that you follow that. We help clients get connected with all the different tax professionals around the world that they need to make sure that they're fully in legal compliance, because we believe in doing things legally here. We're not trying to hide money. We're trying to give you more opportunities. Fill out the form if you're required to fill it out. But you're going to be protecting your money, in my opinion, moving it overseas. I'm not saying you don't want to have any money in the country that you live in, even if the country that you live in is one where the banks aren't that great. You want to pay your local bills. And if you live in the US or the UK, fine, keep some money. But here's the concern. What happens if you start having some of these bank failures? I've been telling you this since the bank failures in 2023. The US government will basically decide if you have over the insured limit, whether they're going to cover you. Most Western countries have some kind of deposit insurance program. In Europe, it's 100,000 euros in a country. So what if you have more than that? Well, we've seen what happened in Cyprus. They give you a haircut. They take some of your money. But that can happen anywhere. If you have more money than the insured limit, they don't have to give you that money. And so that's a decision that Congress and the FDIC in the United States would have to make if they can't find a buyer for some of these banks that might fail. Is, are we going to insure people over $250,000? What I see, culturally speaking, is you're going to have less and less consumer appetite to bail people out who have a lot of money, because people in the U.S. are increasingly suffering. They're not going to want the government's money going to give you back your $1 million, with the government saying, all right, fine, just for the sake of keeping things calm, we'll give everybody their full money back. And by the way, as a libertarian-minded person, hey, that's the risk you take. You have to understand the stability of the financial institutions that you work with. Perhaps they shouldn't. Perhaps if you have $5 million in the bank and it fails, you should only get the $250 back. But I think that you perhaps could feel more comfortable keeping your $5 million in a bank overseas with a better balance sheet. Again, perhaps it's one where they don't lend out your money, or perhaps it's just one where you feel better about the bank itself, where it's in an asset haven where they actually need to, take care of people's wealth. The issue is, are we going to bail out people who have too much money? Even if you look back at the financial crisis, the UAE, they said if any bank fails, and they have higher requirements for who can be a bank, and you have to be traded, and it's more stringent there. If any bank fails, the government will just pay you. Would they do that again? I don't know. But, that's a pretty strong promise. It's a bigger promise than the U.S. government made. And so what concerns me here is Western countries are broke. And as they become broke, and as the world diversifies, and as the economic engine of the world moves away from the West, you have people who are angry about that, and they have less money, and they want the government spending their time and money solving their problems. They don't want the U.S. government bailing someone out who has millions of dollars. And so, all that being said, why would you want to keep all of your money in a Western country where there's talk, not from the Nomad Capitalist, but from analysts, from journalists, from people who study this stuff? They're not trying to create chaos. They're just saying, here's what we see. And obviously, in the last year or so, you've seen a number of bank failures in the U.S. You saw Credit Suisse go down. This is something that I think people kind of forgot about because things have been good for a while. But things will be good until they're not good. And I would want to have my money again. Forget the light asset protection benefits, forget the currency diversification benefits, perhaps even forget the fact that for Americans it's harder, but for everybody else, if you move your money overseas, there could be new investment opportunities that aren't available to you where you live. Put all that aside. I think those are all reasons to want to have some money overseas, but consider, in all these Western countries, things aren't looking perfect. I'm not here to prophesy doom and gloom. I'm not saying you're going to lose all your money. I'm not putting those countries on par with some, banana republic, but I'm saying that smart people are talking about risks. And so what I would want is a banking portfolio. There could be some transactional accounts that you have overseas, what I would call tunnels as well, where you go to a country like a Georgia or an Ecuador or a small country where you can get started with $100, just get an account. And you can use that to get a debit card and pay your bills. You can also get accounts where you basically cold storage, where you're just parking money and it's sitting there until you need it. Call it the war chest, call it whatever you want. That could be Singapore, that could be Switzerland, that could be Liechtenstein, that could be the Bahamas, that could be any number of places. Americans are going to have fewer options, but we have one or two banks in Switzerland that will work with Americans. They happily take Americans from $500,000 to $1 million and up. So there's different price points to get into this. But if I had uninsured money in Western banks, I would say to myself, sure, you could split it between a bunch of different Western banks. And you could say, hey, instead of $1 million in Chase Bank, I'm going to have $250 in 4 different big US banks. Sure, that's a strategy. But who knows what could also happen if smaller banks fail. If things got bad enough, would they come and try and take a haircut from people? I don't know. But wouldn't it be nice to know you have some money where all your eggs aren't in one basket? One of the things that we help our clients do is open bank accounts around the world. Again, we would connect you with tax professionals where you live to make sure that you follow all the legal requirements to where the government's not coming after you because you did something wrong. You want to follow the rules. We also look at things and say, okay, once you're already going offshore and setting up this stuff, do you need a holding company for investments? Do you need a trust? If you're going to have a trust, why not have that trust offshore where you've got greater diversification? And so for me, this is a greater conversation of the conversation that your country's banks are no longer as good as they were always thought to be, says, what should I be changing? Obviously, I would tell you, once you're thinking about all this, you should look at, do I need a second passport? Where do I go when the taxes go through the roof or they try and take some of my money? Countries have borrowed from their citizens' retirement accounts. They've given people haircuts. Who knows what could happen? So I think the main thing for Western bank failure risk is having the cash overseas and then asking myself what structure that's going to go in. Is it an account in my own name? But once you get up to the level of Switzerland and Liechtenstein and the Bahamas, do I want to put that money into a trust and strengthen my asset protection by it not just being offshore, but now it's not even in my name? Yeah, a domestic trust offers me some protection, but an offshore trust is going to offer me greater protection and greater diversification. So one question begets the next. But I think it's part of the greater concept of, is your money as safe in your country as you thought it was? And by the way, even if it turns out it's perfectly fine, what's the harm of having half of your money sitting in Singapore where probably it's also safe? Even if your bank doesn't fail or there's no craziness or Elizabeth Warren doesn't come to tax the hell out of you to pay for some bailout of other banks. What's the harm of diversification? Heck, you could even get a residence permit in some smaller countries by opening bank accounts there. Some in Europe, some in Central and South America, some in Asia, including places like what we talk about, Malaysia. Nomad Capitalist Live is held in Malaysia. We're going to have my Malaysian banker on site to meet people and help you open an account. If you open an account and fund it with enough money, they will give you a multi-year residence permit, and you have the option, but not the obligation, to go and live in Malaysia, tax-friendly Malaysia. So you start to see how, okay, Western banks having an issue, it should spark you to ask many more questions. Not just move some of my money over here, but ask, what happens if banks fail? What happens if I need more asset protection? What can I get by moving money to other countries? Hey, in some cases, you might even be able to get a passport from it. So this is what Nomad Capitalist helps people do. Understand that the world is changing. Take advantage of that, not just in moving the money, but a whole system of how do I take back control, knowing that my country isn't everything I thought it was cracked up to be.